Some people did something. Those four words hung over the history of the 21st century like a shroud. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar had used them to describe September 11, 2001, the day the world broke. The day nearly 3,000 Americans were incinerated, crushed, or forced to jump from windows 100 stories in the sky. She had stood at a podium and reduced the deadliest terrorist attack on American soil to a vague, dismissive footnote, a minor event involving anonymous actors. Some people did something. It was a phrase that haunted the conscience of the nation. It erased the heroism of the firefighters rushing up stairwells they would never descend. It erased the passengers on Flight 93 who voted to die rather than let their plane become a missile. It erased the twisted steel of the Pentagon and the ash that coated Lower Manhattan for weeks. December 11, 2025. Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room. The setting was a place of marble, mahogany, and high-stakes theater. The room was packed to capacity. The gallery was a sea of reporters, activists, and staffers, all buzzing with the anticipation that accompanies a political collision. The C-SPAN cameras were positioned, their red tally lights glowing like unblinking eyes in the dim light. The hearing title was printed on heavy placards positioned on the dais, Combating Anti-Semitism and Hate Crimes in America. It was supposed to be a policy discussion. It was supposed to be a chance for lawmakers to pontificate about tolerance. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar sat at the witness table, adjusting her hijab and offering a confident, practiced smile to the photographers. She had come prepared. Her binder was full of statistics about Islamophobia. Her opening statement was a carefully crafted narrative about how she, a Muslim woman of color, was the victim of constant prejudice. She was ready to lecture the Senate on their biases. She was ready to be the moral authority in the room, but she had made a critical error. She had forgotten who was sitting across from her. Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana sat at the dais. He didn't look like a threat. He looked like a small-town lawyer who spent his weekends fishing and telling stories on the porch. He adjusted his glasses with deliberate slowness, pushing them up the bridge of his nose. He looked down at the desk in front of him. It wasn't empty. It was covered in files. These weren't just standard briefing books. These were thick, heavy folders, stacked high enough to form a small barricade. There were immigration records. There were campaign finance reports. There were divorce filings from multiple counties. There were tax returns with highlighted sections. There were marriage licenses that raised troubling questions. There were summaries of FBI investigations. Kennedy looked up. His expression was placid, his eyes crinkled in what looked like a friendly greeting. When he spoke, that famous Louisiana drawl came out soft, slow, and disarmingly polite. It was the voice of a man offering you iced tea right before he serves you a subpoena. "Congresswoman Omar," Kennedy said, his voice echoing slightly in the hushed room, "I appreciate you taking the time to be here today." He smiled, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach the eyes, the kind that signaled the trap was already sprung. "I've got some questions for you," Kennedy continued, leaning back in his leather chair. "Simple ones, the kind we ask back home in Louisiana when we're trying to figure out if somebody is telling us the truth." Omar nodded, her expression open and cooperative. "I am happy to answer questions regarding the rising tide of hate in this country, Senator." "We'll get to that," Kennedy said, waving a hand dismissively. "But first, I want to clear up a few things about your background, just for the record." He reached for the first folder. It was marked with a red tab. He opened it slowly, smoothing the paper flat with his hand. Let's start with your family, Kennedy said. Omar's smile faded. It didn't vanish entirely, but the warmth drained out of it, leaving a frozen mask. Her lawyer, sitting just behind her right shoulder, leaned in instantly. He whispered something urgent into her ear. His eyes were wide, fixated on the stack of documents on Kennedy's desk. This wasn't the script. This wasn't about Islamophobia. This wasn't about policy. This was an interrogation. Kennedy didn't waste time with any more pleasantries. He didn't ease into the subject. He looked over the rim of his glasses, his face suddenly serious. Congresswoman, in 2009, you married a man named Ahmed Noor Saeed Elmi. Is that correct? The question landed with a thud. Omar shifted in her seat, her body language closing off. She adjusted the microphone, stalling for a second. Senator, she began, her voice taking on a scolding tone, I came here to discuss the very real threats facing my community and the rise of bigotry that— Ma'am, Kennedy interrupted. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. He just cut through her deflection with the unstoppable force of a freight train. I'm just asking about your marriage. It's a matter of public record. It's a simple question. He picked up a piece of paper, a photocopy of a marriage certificate. You married Mr. Elmi on February 12, 2009. Yes or no? The room went deathly quiet. The reporters stopped typing. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the bead of sweat forming on Omar's brow. She looked at her lawyer again. He gave a barely perceptible nod. There was no way to deny a public record. Yes, she said, her voice tight. But these allegations have been addressed years ago and are nothing but right-wing conspiracy theories designed to— Thank you, Kennedy said, cutting her off again with that same maddening politeness. That's a yes. You married him. Kennedy reached into the folder again. He pulled out another document, this one denser, filled with charts and family trees constructed by investigators. He set it down carefully on top of the marriage license. Now, Kennedy said, leaning forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that was louder than a scream. There are serious allegations, Congresswoman, very serious, that Mr. Elmi is not just your husband. He paused, letting the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. The allegation is that Mr. Ahmed Noor Saeed Elmi is your brother, your biological brother. You could hear the camera shutters erupting, click, 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 like a machine gun firing in the gallery. The sound filled the void left by Kennedy's accusation. Is that true? Kennedy asked. Omar's face hardened. Her jaw set like concrete. The friendly mask was gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated fury. She gripped the sides of the witness table. Senator, she hissed, these are disgusting, xenophobic lies that have been thoroughly debunked by— Congresswoman, Kennedy interrupted, holding up one hand in a gesture of peace. I didn't ask if they were disgusting. I didn't ask if you liked them. I asked if they were true. He looked her dead in the eye. Simple question, Kennedy repeated. Is Ahmed Noor Saeed Elmi your brother? The air in the Senate hearing room felt thin, as if the collective intake of breath from the audience had sucked the oxygen right out of the space. Ilhan Omar sat frozen, her eyes locking with Senator Kennedy's. The accusation that she had married her own brother to commit immigration fraud was the nuclear bomb of political scandals. It had been whispered on blogs and forums for years, dismissed by the mainstream media as a fringe conspiracy. But now it was being spoken into the congressional record by a sitting United States senator. Kennedy waited. He didn't fidget. He didn't check his notes. He just watched her, his expression unreadable behind his glasses. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. "No," Omar finally said. The word was sharp, defiant. "Okay," Kennedy said, as if he expected that answer. "No, that's a clear answer." He reached back into the folder. "If the answer is no," Kennedy said, "then this should be very easy to clear up. Can you provide documentation proving that? Can you provide birth certificates showing different parents? Can you provide family records? Will you submit to a DNA test?" Omar's laugh was brittle, a nervous sound that grated on the ears. "Senator, perhaps you are unaware, but the infrastructure in Somalia collapsed during the Civil War. Birth certificates from that era do not exist. Records were destroyed. Asking for documents that you know cannot be produced is a trap." "I understand that, ma'am," Kennedy said, his voice dripping with sympathy. "Truly, I do. It was a terrible time. But here is the thing." He pulled out a timeline graphic and placed it on the dais. "You became a United States citizen in 2000, Kennedy noted. "You had to prove your identity then. You have been in this country for decades. You have had 26 years to gather documentation. You have family members here. You have siblings here." He looked at her over the rim of his glasses. "Can you prove Mr. Elmi is not your brother?" Omar looked at her lawyer. The lawyer was staring at the table, refusing to make eye contact with the senator. He shook his head slightly, a signal to stop talking. "I have already addressed these false allegations in multiple interviews," Omar said, falling back on her talking points. "This is harassment." "You've denied them," Kennedy corrected gently. "That is different from disproving them. A denial is just words. Proof is evidence." He moved the marriage license aside and pulled out a new document. It was a court filing. "Let me read from your own divorce filing," Kennedy said. "December 20th, 2017. You were divorcing Mr. Elm. In this document, you stated under oath, and I want to emphasize that, under oath, that you had no contact with Mr. Elm since June 2011. Kennedy looked up. "No contact for 6 years. You couldn't locate him. You didn't know where he was. That is what you testified to the court to get a default divorce. Is that correct?" "That is what the filing states," Omar said carefully. "But, Congresswoman," Kennedy drawled, reaching for a new stack of papers. These were glossy printouts, high resolution, and damning. "We have a problem." He laid the photos out like a winning poker hand. "We have photographs," Kennedy said, tapping the first one. "We have social media posts." He tapped the second. "We have address records." He tapped the third. "All showing you and Mr. Elmi at the same locations, at the same events, living at the same addresses." Kennedy slid the photos across the polished wood of the dais so she could see them. "Here you are in 2014, Kennedy said. "Here you are in 2015. Here you are in London in 2016. He leaned back. "How do you explain that? You testified to a court of law that you hadn't seen this man since 2011. Yet here you are, standing next to him, smiling, 5 years later. One of those things has to be false. Either the photo is a lie, or your sworn testimony was a lie." "Senator, I am not going to answer questions about unverified photographs from the internet," Omar snapped, pushing the pictures away. "They are from his social media accounts, ma'am," Kennedy countered instantly. "Time-stamped, geotagged, posted by the man himself. Were you in contact with Mr. Elmi between 2011 and 2017? Her lawyer leaned in hard, his hand covering the microphone, whispering urgently into her ear. The veins in his neck were visible. He knew exactly what Kennedy was doing. He was building a perjury trap. Omar's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. She took a sip, her eyes darting around the room, looking for an exit that didn't exist. "I am not going to answer questions that could be construed as evidence of legal matters that are settled," she stammered. Kennedy tilted his head. He looked like a disappointed grandfather. "Congresswoman," he said softly, "lying under oath in a divorce proceeding is perjury. That is a felony. Are you refusing to answer because the truth would incriminate you?" Chairman Durbin, the Democrat leading the committee, finally seemed to wake up to the disaster unfolding in front of him. He reached for his gavel. "Senator Kennedy," Durbin interrupted, his voice stern, "I think we are straying far from the subject of this hearing. We are here to discuss hate crimes." "Mr. Chairman," Kennedy said, turning his body to face Durbin but keeping his eyes on Omar, "the Congresswoman is here to testify about hate. She is asking the American people to trust her judgment. I am establishing credibility. If she lied under oath about her own marriage, about her own brother, why should this committee believe anything else she says?" Durbin grimaced. He looked at the cameras. He knew that shutting Kennedy down now would look like a cover-up. He nodded slowly, defeated. "Keep it relevant, Senator." Kennedy turned back to Omar. He took his time. He let the silence weigh on her. "Let me make this real simple," Kennedy said. "Yes or no questions. Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi, is he your brother?" "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Will you release your immigration records to prove it?" Kennedy asked. "I have been advised by counsel not to," she replied mechanically. "Will you take a DNA test? Right now? We can arrange it. Clear this up once and for all. Prove the conspiracy theorists wrong." "This is harassment, Senator," she deflected. "And will you provide birth certificates showing he is not your brother?" "They don't exist because of the Civil War," she repeated. Kennedy held up his hand. He smiled that smile again, the one that signaled the end of the game. "Congresswoman," he said, "you know what we call it in Louisiana when somebody makes a serious allegation against you, an allegation that you committed a felony, that you married your sibling, and you refuse to provide any evidence at all to clear yourself?" Omar glared at him, silent, her chest heaving with suppressed rage. "We call that guilty," Kennedy said, "because innocent people want to prove they are innocent. They want to clear their names. They scream it from the rooftops. They show the papers. They don't hide behind lawyers and excuses about civil wars." He closed the file with a sharp snap. "But we aren't done," Kennedy said, "because if the marriage was a fraud, then the tax returns are a crime." He reached for the next file. It was thicker. Senator Kennedy didn't give the room time to recover from the perjury implication. He moved with the relentless momentum of a man who knows exactly where the bodies are buried because he brought the shovel. He reached for the next file, this one thicker, bound with a heavy rubber band. It landed on the dais with a dull, authoritative thud that seemed to echo in the silence. "Let's talk about your taxes," Kennedy said. His tone shifted from disappointment to something sharper, more clinical. "Because if the marriage situation is, let's call it messy, the tax situation is criminal." He opened the folder and pulled out a document stamped with the seal of the Minnesota Campaign Finance and Public Disclosure Board. "In 2014 and 2015, Kennedy read, peering over his spectacles, "you filed joint federal tax returns with a man named Ahmed Hirsi. Is that correct?" Omar looked at her lawyer. He gave a curt nod, his face tight. There was no point in denying what was already in the public record. "I would have to review my specific tax history to be certain of the exact years, but..." The Minnesota Campaign Finance Board already reviewed it for you, Kennedy interrupted, holding up the finding. They found, and you admitted, that you filed joint returns with Mr. Hersey in 2014 and 2015. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the polished wood. Here is the interesting part, Congresswoman. As we just established with the previous document, you were legally married to Mr. Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi from 2009 until 2017. Kennedy paused, letting the timeline sink in for the television audience. You were married to Mr. Elmi, he said, pointing to the marriage license on his left. But you filed joint taxes with Mr. Hersey, he said, pointing to the tax findings on his right. Now, I'm just a country lawyer, Kennedy drawled, his voice dripping with false modesty. But even down in Louisiana, we know the rules. You cannot file joint tax returns with someone you are not married to. That is fraud. And you certainly cannot do it while you are legally married to someone else. That is bigamy. Senator, my tax filings were prepared by a professional who made an error regarding my marital status, Omar said, her voice rising in defensive pitch. It was a mistake that was corrected, and a fine was paid. Fraudulent, Kennedy corrected her instantly. The friendly veneer vanished. The word you are looking for is not mistake. It is fraudulent. He picked up the tax document and waved it slightly. You filed federal documents under penalty of perjury, claiming to be married to a man you were not married to. You did this to receive tax benefits. You did this while you were hiding your actual legal husband, the one who might be your brother, from the government. You know what we call that where I'm from? Kennedy asked. He let the question hang in the air. 10 seconds. 15. The tension was suffocating. We call that a crime spree. Omar tried to speak. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. She looked at her lawyer, who was now furiously typing on his phone, likely preparing a press release to claim victimhood before the hearing was even over. I don't have to answer these politically motivated attacks, she finally managed, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. And I'm not done, Kennedy said, ignoring her protest. He reached into the file and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a tax return, it was a memo. It looked official, stamped with Department of Homeland Security headers. You might want to listen to this part carefully, Kennedy advised. Tom Homan, the border czar, confirmed just last month that Homeland Security Investigations, HSI, is actively investigating you for immigration fraud. Not a past investigation, not a closed case. An active, ongoing federal investigation. The color drained from Omar's face. This wasn't public knowledge. This was a bombshell. That investigation is happening right now, today, as we speak, Kennedy said, his voice dropping to a whisper. They are looking at the marriage. They are looking at the taxes. They are looking at the brother question. He looked at her with a gaze that was almost pitying. So, let's review. You lied on your marriage license. You lied on your divorce filings. You lied on your tax returns. And now, the Department of Homeland Security is trying to figure out if you lied to get into the country in the first place. Kennedy stacked the documents neatly. The marriage license at the bottom, the tax returns in the middle, the HSI memo on top. It was a paper tower of illegality. You act like you are above the law, Kennedy said. You lecture Americans about justice. You lecture us about equity. But while you were preaching, you were committing felonies. That is a lie, Omar shouted, finally snapping. I have never been charged with a crime. This is a witch hunt designed to silence a powerful Muslim voice. You haven't been charged yet, Kennedy said, emphasizing the last word. "But the day is young, Congresswoman, and the receipts are right here." Senator Kennedy sat back in his chair. He took a slow breath, letting the adrenaline in the room settle into a heavy, suffocating dread. He looked at the stack of documents he had assembled. It was a physical manifestation of a double life. Marriage licenses that didn't match reality. Tax returns that defied the law. Divorce decrees that perjured the truth. He took off his glasses and began to clean them with a small cloth. A deliberate, leisurely motion that signaled he was shifting gears. He wasn't the prosecutor anymore. He was the philosopher. "Congresswoman," Kennedy said, putting his glasses back on, "I want to zoom out for a second. I want to ask you a question that I think millions of Americans are asking themselves right now." He gestured to the pile of evidence. "We have established that you went to extraordinary lengths to stay in this country. You married a man, allegedly your brother. You filed false taxes. You lied to divorce courts. You navigated a labyrinth of deception just to maintain your status in the United States." Kennedy leaned forward, his elbows on the dais, his hands clasped. "But here is the thing I don't understand. I listen to your speeches. I read your tweets. I hear what you say about this country." He began to recite her greatest hits from memory, his voice calm but laced with disbelief. "You call America a colonizer. You call us systemically racist. You compare our military to the Taliban and Hamas. You say we are founded on genocide. You say we are an evil empire. You attack our history, our values, our police, our soldiers, and our very existence." Kennedy paused, looking her dead in the eye. "So, here is my question, Congresswoman." He pointed a finger at the stack of fraud evidence. "If America is so terrible, if we are so racist, so Islamophobic, so unjust, so evil, why did you commit fraud to stay here?" The question detonated in the room. The gallery erupted. It wasn't just a gasp this time. It was a release of years of pent-up frustration. Someone in the back shouted, "Answer the question!" Chairman Durbin banged his gavel furiously, shouting for order, but the noise drowned him out. The cameras were going crazy, zooming in on Omar's face, catching the exact moment her narrative collapsed. She sat frozen. Her mouth was a tight line. Her lawyer was staring at the floor. It was the paradox that defined her entire career, laid bare in a single sentence. She built her brand on hating America, yet she had broken the law to remain in America. Kennedy waited. He let the chaos swirl around him, an island of calm in the storm he had created. When the noise finally subsided enough for him to be heard, he spoke again. "Why not go back to Somalia?" Kennedy asked gently. "Or any other country that meets your moral standards? Why fight so hard, lie so much, and risk prison just to stay in a country you seem to despise?" Omar finally found her voice, but it was weak, stripped of its usual arrogance. I am here to fight for a better America. I criticize because I love—" "No," Kennedy cut her off. "Critics don't commit fraud. Critics don't marry their siblings to game the system. People who love a country don't compare it to terrorists." He shook his head. "You don't stay because you want to fix it. You stay because you know the truth. You know that even with all the flaws you obsess over, America is the greatest nation on earth. You know that nowhere else would give a refugee the power, the money, and the platform you have here." "You love the benefits of America," Kennedy said, his voice hard. "You just hate the Americans who provide them." He moved the fraud documents to the side, clearing the space in front of him. You committed crimes to stay in a country you call evil, Kennedy summarized. That's not activism, Congresswoman. That is hypocrisy. And in Louisiana, we call that being a grifter. He reached for the next file. This one was different. It wasn't about her marriage or her money. It was about her words. Let's talk about why you are really here today, Kennedy said, his tone shifting back to the subject of the hearing. Let's talk about anti-Semitism. He pulled out a new stack of papers, printed tweets, transcripts of speeches, and House resolutions. You've been accused of it repeatedly, Kennedy said. The House of Representatives voted to condemn your comments in 2019. You were removed from the Foreign Affairs Committee in 2023. Multiple Jewish organizations have formally called you out. Senator, criticism of Israeli policy is not the same as, Omar began, launching into her standard defense. Ma'am, Kennedy cut her off gently. I didn't mention Israeli policy. I mentioned anti-Semitism. There is a difference, and I am going to show you exactly what I mean. He picked up the first tweet, printed on glossy paper, and held it up for the world to see. Senator Kennedy adjusted the microphone, the metallic screech momentarily breaking the heavy silence. He didn't look angry. He looked like a history professor preparing to fail a student who hadn't done the reading. He held the glossy printout of the tweet between his thumb and forefinger, treating it like a piece of evidence found at a crime scene. Let's start with 2012, Kennedy said. You were 30 years old. You had lived in the United States for 17 years. You were an adult. He read the text aloud, his voice devoid of emotion. Israel has hypnotized the world. May Allah awaken the people and help them see the evil doings of Israel. Kennedy lowered the paper. Hypnotized. That is a very specific word, Congresswoman. It isn't a policy critique. You didn't say Israel's settlement policy is wrong. You said they hypnotize the world. He looked at her over his glasses. That is an ancient anti-Semitic trope. The Jew as the deceiver. The Jew with secret mystical powers to mind control the masses. The Jew as the puppet master. Do you understand that? I have apologized for that tweet, Omar said quickly, her voice rehearsed. I was young, and I didn't fully understand the historical context of the word. I was expressing frustration with the Gaza war. You were 30, Kennedy repeated. But let's say I believe you. Let's say you were just ignorant. You apologized. You said you learned. He reached for the next sheet of paper. Then came February 2019. You were a member of Congress now, a leader. Someone asked why Republicans support Israel, and you tweeted this. Kennedy held up the second printout. It was the one that had caused a firestorm. It's all about the Benjamin's baby. Benjamins, Kennedy noted. Slang for $100 bills. You were saying that American support for Israel isn't based on shared values, or democracy, or security. You were saying it was bought. You were saying Jews buy political support with cash. I was referring to AIPAC's lobbying expenditures, Omar interrupted, her voice rising. I have a right to criticize the role of money in politics. That is not hate speech. You didn't say lobbying, Kennedy countered, his voice cutting through hers. You made it about money. The greedy Jew buying the government. That is the oldest slur in the book, Congresswoman. The blood libel of finance. Jews and money. Jews and control. He leaned back. Nancy Pelosi condemned you. Chuck Schumer condemned you. Jerry Nadler, a Jewish Democrat who chairs a committee with you, condemned you. Your own party leadership said you crossed the line into bigotry. Were they all wrong? Or do you just have a problem with Jews? I have consistently stated my support for the Jewish community while maintaining the right to criticize a foreign government, Omar insisted, her hands gripping the table. Words matter, Kennedy said softly, and your words always seem to land on the same stereotypes. He pulled out another document. This one was a transcript from a 2021 town hall. And then you doubled down, Kennedy said. You stood in front of an audience and said that Americans shouldn't have to push for allegiance to a foreign country. Allegiance. Kennedy shook his head. The dual loyalty smear, accusing Jewish Americans of being more loyal to Israel than to America. That is the accusation dictators used to round people up. It's the accusation used to justify pogroms, and you threw it around like it was nothing. I was discussing political influence. You were questioning the loyalty of American citizens based on their faith, Kennedy corrected. There is a pattern here, Congresswoman. Hypnotized, Benjamins, allegiance. He stacked the three papers on top of each other. It's not a mistake. It's not a typo. It's a world view. Kennedy reached for a thicker document, House Resolution 1207. February 2023, Kennedy read. A resolution was introduced to censure you, not for one comment, but for a documented history of anti-Semitism. It didn't pass because your party protected you, but the record stands. The resolution documented your pattern. He looked at her with genuine curiosity. You know what is really sad about this? When you were first elected, the Jewish community welcomed you. Synagogues in Minnesota reached out. They wanted to build bridges. They wanted to help you succeed as a refugee. And how did you repay that kindness? He pointed to the stack of tweets. With conspiracy theories, with slurs, with hatred. That is a mischaracterization of my record, Omar shouted. Is it? Kennedy asked. Then let's look at who you compare America to. He reached for the next file. The tension in the room was palpable. Senator Kennedy moved the stack of tweets to the side, creating a clean space on the dais for his next exhibit. He pulled out a transcript from a video, dated June 2021. Let's talk about your view of the world, Kennedy said, because it explains a lot. He put on his reading glasses. You tweeted, and then defended on video, that we have seen unthinkable atrocities committed by the U.S., Hamas, Israel, Afghanistan, and the Taliban. You grouped them all together. Kennedy looked up over the rim of his glasses. You put the United States of America, the country that gave you refuge, the country you swore an oath to serve, in the same category as Hamas and the Taliban. Terrorist organizations, murderers, rapists. I was calling for accountability for violations of international law by all actors, Omar defended, her voice taking on a professorial tone. The International Criminal Court should have jurisdiction to investigate. You compared America to terrorists, Kennedy interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, becoming gravelly and hard. Hamas murdered 200 Israelis on October 7th. They raped women. They beheaded babies. They burned families alive in their homes. They took grandmothers hostage. He leaned forward. And you think America is the same as that? You think Israel defending itself is the same as that? The context of that statement was about the ICC. The context doesn't matter. Kennedy's voice rose, cracking like a whip. There is no context where you compare the United States military to the Taliban. None. You compared our soldiers to terrorists who throw acid in the faces of girls who want to go to school. He slammed the transcript down. But it gets worse. Let's fast forward to April 2024, Columbia University. Kennedy pulled out a photo of the protests. It showed students occupying a lawn, waving flags, chanting slogans. "You went there," Kennedy said. "You stood with the protesters. You encouraged them. And when a reporter asked you about the anti-Semitism on campus, about Jewish students being blocked from classes, being spat on, being threatened, you said this." He picked up a card and read her exact words. "We should not have to tolerate anti-Semitism or bigotry for all Jewish students, whether they are pro-genocide or anti-genocide." Kennedy set the card down slowly. He took off his glasses. He looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and disgust. "Pro-genocide," he repeated. "You called Jewish students, students who support the existence of the State of Israel, students whose grandparents might have died in the Holocaust, you called them pro-genocide." That comment has been taken out of context by those seeking to silence. "What context?" Kennedy demanded. "What context makes calling a Jewish student genocidal acceptable? Please, explain it to me. I'm just a simple senator. Explain how a student wearing a yarmulke and walking to class is pro-genocide because he believes Israel has a right to exist." Silence. Omar's hands gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles were white. She couldn't explain it because there was no explanation. It was a slur, plain and simple. "You can't do it," Kennedy said, "because it is indefensible. You labeled Jewish students as monsters to justify the harassment against them. You gave the mob permission to hate them." "That is blood libel, Congresswoman," Kennedy said, "accusing Jews of mass murder. It is the modern version of accusing them of killing Christian babies. And you said it on a college campus to a group of angry radicals." He picked up a statement from the Anti-Defamation League. "The ADL condemned you. The American Jewish Committee condemned you. They said, Representative Omar has a Jewish problem. Despite her repeated denials, there is an unmistakable pattern." Kennedy looked at her. "A pattern. That is the key word. Not a mistake. Not a misunderstanding. A pattern of anti-Semitism spanning more than a decade." "Senator, I have Jewish constituents who support me," Omar cried out. "Tokenism," Kennedy shot back. "That's what that is called. Some of my best friends are Jewish. It's the oldest defense in the book. It doesn't make your comments any less anti-Semitic. It doesn't make your pattern any less clear." He gathered the evidence, the tweets, the transcripts, the photos, and stacked them in a pile in front of her. "Here is the truth, Congresswoman," Kennedy said. "You don't have a problem with Israeli policy. You have a problem with Jews. You've proven it over and over. And the reason we know it's not about human rights is simple." He leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. "You don't talk about China's genocide of the Uyghurs. You don't talk about Iran's oppression of women. You don't condemn Hamas's terrorism. You don't mention Hezbollah's attacks. You save all your outrage for one country, the Jewish state." "That isn't about human rights," Kennedy said. "That is about Jews." "That is absolutely false," Omar shouted. "I have spoken extensively about—" "Show me one tweet," Kennedy challenged. "Show me one tweet calling out Hamas. Show me one speech condemning Hezbollah. Show me one protest about Iran executing women for not wearing a hijab. Just one." He gestured to the empty air. "Silence," Kennedy noted. "You can't do it. Because your obsession isn't with human rights. It's with Jews. And that, Congresswoman, makes you an anti-Semite." Kennedy picked up his pen and made a note on his pad. He looked up at her, his expression weary. "If America is so racist and terrible, why did you commit fraud to stay here?" he asked, linking the threads together. "And if Jews are so evil, Why did they keep trying to help you, to educate you, to forgive you? Omar stared at the table, saying nothing. Her defense had crumbled. The narrative of the victimized refugee had been replaced by the reality of the hateful ideologue. "Some people did something," Kennedy said quietly. He let the phrase hang there. "Isn't that how you describe things you don't want to talk about?" Kennedy watched her process the shift. He saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes. She knew what was coming next. The phrase that had started it all. He reached for the next file. It was black. Let's talk about September 11th, 2001. The hearing room was so quiet, you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Senator Kennedy placed the file on the dais with reverence, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at Ilhan Omar, not with the sharp accusatory glare he had used for the fraud allegations, but with a somber, heavy gaze. "Let's talk about September 11th, 2001, Kennedy said softly. "You remember that day, Congresswoman?" "Of course I remember," Omar replied, her voice steady but guarded. "Everyone remembers." "Where were you?" Kennedy asked. "I was in high school, in Minneapolis." "So, you were here," Kennedy noted. "In America. Safe. You watched it happen on television like the rest of us. You saw the towers fall. You saw the smoke." "Yes," she said. "Good." Kennedy opened the file. "Then you know what happened. 19 terrorists hijacked 4 airplanes. They flew 2 into the World Trade Center. They flew 1 into the Pentagon. 1 crashed in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, because the passengers fought back and died to save the Capitol. Nearly 3,000 Americans were murdered in a single morning." He paused, letting the weight of the numbers fill the room. "Now, let me read you something you said," Kennedy said, picking up a transcript. "March 23, 2019. You were speaking at a CAIAR fundraiser in Los Angeles. CAIAR, the Council on American Islamic Relations." Kennedy put on his reading glasses. He read the words slowly, enunciating every syllable. CAIAR was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something and that all of us were starting to lose access to our civil liberties. Kennedy set the transcript down. He took off his glasses. He looked at her. "Some people did something," Kennedy repeated. "That is how you describe the mass murder of 3,000 of your fellow citizens. Some people did something." The gallery murmured. A few people shook their heads. Chairman Durbin looked down at his hands, unwilling to intervene. "Senator, that comment has been deliberately taken out of context by right-wing media to vilify me," Omar said, launching into her defense. "I was speaking about the civil liberties of Muslims in the aftermath." "What context makes that acceptable?" Kennedy interrupted, his voice rising just enough to cut her off. "What context makes minimizing the worst terrorist attack in American history okay? You described an act of war like it was a traffic accident, like it was a minor misunderstanding. I was trying to address the broader issue of how the Muslim community has faced discrimination," she insisted. "You were making yourself the victim," Kennedy corrected her. "That is what you were doing. In your worldview, the real tragedy of 9/11 wasn't that 3,000 Americans died. It was that people looked at you differently afterward. You took the death of thousands and made it about you." Kennedy reached into the file and pulled out a stack of photographs. He didn't slide them across the table this time. He held them up, one by one, facing her. "These are the some people you referenced, Congresswoman," Kennedy said. "This is Wells Crowther," Kennedy said, holding up the photo of the young man in the red bandana. 24 years old. He saved a dozen people in the South Tower. He carried them on his back. He went back up the stairs while everyone else was running down. The tower collapsed on him. He died a hero. He put the photo down and picked up another. "This is Stephen Siller," Kennedy said. "Off-duty firefighter. He heard the news. He put on 60 pounds of gear and ran through the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel toward the towers because his truck couldn't get through. He ran toward the fire. He never came home." Kennedy's voice cracked slightly, then hardened into steel. "And you turned their sacrifice into, 'some people did something'?" "Senator, I never intended to minimize their sacrifice," Omar said, looking away from the photos. "Intent doesn't matter," Kennedy said. "Words matter, and your words were cruel." He picked up one last photo. It wasn't of a victim. It was of a man standing at a podium, holding a picture of his mother. "This is Nicholas Harros, Jr.," Kennedy said. His mother, Francine, was murdered in the North Tower. On the 18th anniversary of 9/11, he stood at Ground Zero and he spoke to you directly. Do you know what he said? Omar stayed silent. He said, "Congresswoman Omar, I hope you never forget that day was the result of hate. Some people did something? Are you kidding me? My mother was attacked. Our constitutional freedoms were attacked. And you said some people did something." Kennedy leaned forward. He ended with 3 words: "Shame on you." Kennedy set the photo down gently. "Shame on you," Kennedy echoed. Those were his words, the son of a woman who was murdered while just trying to go to work. Shame on you. "And you know what?" Kennedy asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "He is right. Shame on you for turning terrorism into a vague abstraction. Shame on you for claiming victimhood on the graves of 3,000 Americans." He pulled out a fact sheet. "And here is the other thing," Kennedy added. "You said Caire was founded after 9/11. That is false. Caire was founded in 1994, 7 years before 9/11. You couldn't even get the basic facts of your own talking point right because you were so eager to push the narrative that Muslims were the victims." "I misspoke about the founding date," Omar muttered. "You lied," Kennedy said. "Or you didn't care enough to check. Either way, you used a false narrative to erase American suffering." Kennedy gathered the photos: Wells Crowther, Stephen Siller, Francine Harros, and placed them in a neat stack facing her. "You know what the squad does, Congresswoman?" Kennedy asked. "You take every tragedy and you twist it until it is about you. 9/11 becomes about Muslim civil liberties. Israel defending itself becomes about you being silenced. Police shooting a criminal becomes about systemic oppression against you." "Everything is grievance," Kennedy said. "Everything is oppression. Everything is victimhood." He leaned back, shaking his head. "But you aren't victims. You are members of the United States Congress. You have power. You have privilege. You have wealth. You flew to Columbia University on our dime with a security detail to support protesters who were chanting, 'Death to America.' You stood with them," Kennedy said. "You called them the victims, while they blocked Jewish students from class, while they burned flags. You stood there and smiled." "Some people did something," Kennedy repeated, tasting the bitterness of the words. "Those 4 words will define you forever, Congresswoman. Every September 11th, Americans will remember that when the country was mourning, you were complaining." Kennedy paused. He let the shame in the room breathe. "If America is so terrible," Kennedy asked quietly, returning to his central theme, "why did you commit fraud to stay here? And if 9/11 was just some people doing something, Why do you need our protection so badly? He didn't wait for an answer. He reached for the next file. This one was about greed. Senator Kennedy shifted gears. The somber atmosphere of the 9/11 questioning evaporated, replaced by the clinical forensic tone of a financial auditor. He pulled out a file that was thick with bank records, receipts, and court filings. "Let's talk about how you spend your supporters' money," Kennedy said. "Because if your words are hateful, your spending is criminal." He opened the folder to a section marked FEC Complaints. "Your campaign paid a man named Tim Minette," Kennedy stated. "He runs a consulting firm called the E Street Group. Between July 2018 and March 2019, you paid him $230,000. Kennedy slid the payment records across the table. They were highlighted in neon yellow. For consulting, for digital communications, for travel expenses, $230,000 in 8 months. That is a lot of money, Congresswoman." Omar reached for her water glass again. Her hand was noticeably shaking now. She didn't touch the documents. "Here is where it gets interesting," Kennedy said, pulling out a new document. "This is a divorce filing. August 2019. Tim Minette's wife, Beth, filed for divorce." Kennedy adjusted his glasses. In her complaint, she stated, and I am reading directly from court documents, that Tim told her he was romantically involved with Representative Ilhan Omar. The room erupted. The cameras went into a frenzy. Chairman Durbin banged his gavel, but Kennedy just raised his voice slightly, cutting through the noise. "Romantically involved," Kennedy repeated. "That means an affair, Congresswoman. While he was married, while you were married. And during that affair, your campaign paid him $250,000. Senator, my personal relationships are not the subject of this hearing," Omar snapped, her face flushing. "Your campaign finances are the subject," Kennedy countered instantly. "Your use of donor money is the subject." He held up the divorce filing. Beth Minette's complaint states that Tim's more recent travel and long work hours now appear to be more related to his affair with Representative Ilhan Omar than with his actual work commitments. Kennedy looked at her. "You used campaign money to pay your lover's travel expenses. Money that donors gave you. Hard-earned money from supporters who thought it was going to campaign for progressive values. Instead, it paid for your romantic getaways." "That is a completely false characterization," Omar insisted. "Mr. Minette provided legitimate consulting services." "Then why did the payments start the exact same month he told his wife about the affair?" Kennedy asked, holding up the timeline. "First payment to E Street Group, July 2018, Kennedy read. "Same month Tim confessed to Beth. Coincidence? The timing of my campaign's consulting contracts is not evidence of... It is evidence of using campaign funds for personal expenses," Kennedy interrupted. "That is illegal. You cannot use donor money for personal things. Travel with your boyfriend is personal, not campaign. That is fraud." He pulled out more records. $230,000 in 8 months, Kennedy said. "And it didn't stop there. By the time it was over, your campaign had paid his firm nearly $2.8 million. Kennedy let that number hang in the air. $2.8 million. Think about that, Kennedy said, turning to the cameras. That is what 4 families make in a lifetime. That is college tuition for an entire neighborhood. And you used it to enrich your lover, who became your husband. You know what we call that in Louisiana? Kennedy asked. He paused. Stealing. You stole from your own supporters. Omar's lawyer was whispering frantically again, but she shook her head, looking trapped. Let's talk about your net worth, Kennedy said, pivoting to the next document. Financial disclosure forms, May 2024. He held up the form. You filed your disclosure. Your net worth increased 3,500% in 1 year, from less than $1 million to somewhere between $6 million and $30 million. Kennedy set the form down. 3,500% in 1 year, on a congressional salary of $174,000. Care to explain that? My financial disclosures are compliant with all House requirements, she recited robotically. I didn't ask if they were compliant, Kennedy said. I asked where the money came from. How does a congresswoman make $30 million in a year? Silence. Your husband, Tim Minot, Kennedy answered for her. His venture capital firm, Rose Lake Capital. It is listed as worth somewhere between $5 million and $25 million on your disclosure. That is a lot of money for a political consultant. Kennedy pulled out a news report from the New York Post. December 2025. Last week, Kennedy said. The Post reported that Rose Lake Capital suddenly purged all officer names from its website. Just deleted them. Right when the Minnesota welfare fraud investigation started heating up. Interesting timing, Kennedy noted. Don't you think? That is a completely routine business practice, Omar said, though her voice lacked conviction. Is it? Kennedy asked. Or are you trying to hide something? You were broke when you got elected. Your own disclosures show it. Now you are worth $30 million. And when investigators start asking questions, names disappear from websites. Kennedy leaned forward, his voice dropping to that dangerous, soft drawl. You know what we call that in Louisiana? Suspicious. He pulled out the findings from the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board again. June 2019, Kennedy read. They found you violated campaign finance laws. You used campaign funds for personal travel to Washington, Boston, New York, Chicago, and Florida. Illegal personal use. Those violations were minor, and I paid the required penalties, she dismissed. They were violations, Kennedy said firmly. You broke the law. You used donor money for personal trips, just like you used it to pay your boyfriend. There is a pattern here, Congresswoman. Taking money that doesn't belong to you? Kennedy stacked the documents into a damning tower. The FEC complaints, the divorce filings, the financial disclosures, the CFB violations. Let me paint a picture, Kennedy said. You come to America as a refugee. America gives you everything: safety, education, opportunity. You become a congresswoman. People donate to your campaigns because they believe in you. They trust you. And you steal from them. You pay your lover with their money. You somehow become a multimillionaire on a government salary. You hide your finances. You delete names from websites when investigators come calling. He looked at her with pure disdain. Congresswoman, you came here with nothing. America gave you everything. And you turned around and stole from the very people who supported you. You betrayed them. You took their trust and used it to enrich yourself and your lover. Kennedy's voice got quiet, dangerous. If America is so terrible, so corrupt, so broken, why did you commit fraud to stay here? Why not go back to a country where this kind of corruption is just normal? Why steal from Americans if you hate America so much? Kennedy pulled out the thickest file yet. It was the finale. News reports, indictments, court records, Department of Justice press releases. He opened the file slowly. Let's talk about Minnesota, your district, your constituents. Let's talk about the largest welfare fraud scheme in Minnesota history. Senator Kennedy placed his hand on the final file. It was the heaviest of them all, bulging with indictments, court transcripts, and FBI forensic reports. The previous files had been about Ilhan Omar's personal corruption, her marriages, her taxes, her campaign funds. But this file was different. This file was about something darker. It was about systemic theft on a scale that was almost difficult to comprehend. "Let's talk about the Feeding Our Future scandal," Kennedy said, his voice dropping to a gravelly low. "The largest welfare fraud scheme in Minnesota history. Maybe the largest pandemic fraud in the history of the United States." He opened the file, revealing a stack of mugshots and lists of seized assets. $250 million, Kennedy said, letting the number hang in the air like smoke. $250 million. Gone. He looked at Omar. That money was meant to feed hungry children during the pandemic. It was meant to ensure that kids who couldn't go to school didn't starve. Instead, it was stolen. Kennedy pulled out a summary of the indictments. 93 people charged, Kennedy read. Many already convicted. They set up fake child care centers. They claimed to be feeding thousands of children a day. They submitted invoices to the Federal Child and Adult Care Food Program. They got reimbursed by the government. He picked up a photo of a luxury car dealership. But they didn't buy food, Congresswoman. They bought Porsches. They bought mansions. They bought jewelry. They took trips to Dubai and Kenya. They lived like kings on money that was supposed to buy milk and bread for starving kids. Kennedy leaned forward. And you know what made this possible? He pulled out a piece of legislation. The Meals Act. You supported it. You pushed for it. You lobbied the USDA to waive oversight requirements. You argued that checking for fraud was racist and burdensome. You demanded that the guardrails be taken down. The Meals Act was designed to ensure children could access nutrition during a global health crisis, Omar said, her voice tight. When normal oversight was impossible, we prioritized feeding children. You removed the oversight, Kennedy corrected her. That is what you did. You opened the bank vault and fired the security guard. And then you acted surprised when the bank got robbed. Kennedy pulled out a specific indictment. Let's look at how the scheme worked. It wasn't subtle. One feeding site, Ado, claimed to be feeding thousands of children a day. Do you know where it was? It was a second-floor apartment in a building with no elevator. Thousands of kids? In an apartment? He pulled out another. Another site claimed to be feeding thousands of children in a parking lot in the middle of winter. Federal investigators checked. Do you know what they found? An empty lot. No kids. No food. Just invoices for millions of dollars. And the conspirators didn't even try to hide it well, Kennedy scoffed. They used a website called List of Random Names to generate the rosters of children. They invented kids out of thin air. And the money kept flowing because the oversight was gone. Because of the pressure you applied to the state agencies to keep the money moving. Those are the actions of criminals, not my office, Omar deflected. 3 people charged in this scheme have alleged ties to you, Kennedy noted, holding up a connection chart. Your past campaigns, your community organizations. These aren't strangers, Congresswoman. These are people in your orbit. Kennedy pulled out a transcript from a Fox News interview. But here is the part that makes me sick, Kennedy said. When you were asked about this, when you were asked if you regretted pushing to remove the oversight, if you thought your advocacy enabled this fraud, do you know what you said? He read her answer aloud. Absolutely not. It helped feed kids. Kennedy set the paper down and took off his glasses. He looked at her with genuine horror. Absolutely not, he repeated. $250 million stolen. 93 people indicted. Money for starving children spent on luxury resorts in Nairobi. And you have no regrets? You say, absolutely not? Congresswoman, how many kids were actually fed with that stolen money? Kennedy asked. Show us the numbers. Show us the receipts. Show us proof that real children ate real meals. You can't, Kennedy said, because the money didn't go to kids. It went to fraud. He pulled out a statement from Somali community leaders in Minneapolis. Your own constituents are horrified, Kennedy said. These leaders, Somali elders, are begging for accountability. They say this fraud makes the whole community look bad. They say it stains the reputation of honest immigrants. They are furious. And what do? Kennedy asked. You defend the system that enabled it. You say you have no regrets. Kennedy gathered the indictments, the photos of the seized cars, and the legislative records. Congresswoman, you came to America as a refugee. You know hunger. You spent 4 years in a refugee camp. You know what it is like to wonder where your next meal is coming from. You, of all people, should understand how precious these food programs are. He pointed a finger at her. And yet, you enabled people to steal from hungry children. You created the environment where $250 million could vanish. And when you were caught, you didn't apologize. You didn't demand justice. You said you were proud of it. Kennedy's voice dropped to a whisper, cold and hard as steel. You stood in that refugee camp as a child, hungry and desperate, waiting for America to save you. And America did. We took you in. We fed you. We gave you a life. And then you turned around and helped people steal food from children just like you used to be. He paused, letting the weight of the accusation crush the remaining air in the room. Evil. Not just corrupt. Not just wrong. Evil. Stealing food from children is evil. Enabling it is evil. Defending it is evil. Kennedy looked at the pile of documents, the marriage fraud, the tax fraud, the campaign theft, the hate speech, the 9/11 minimization, and now the food theft. If America is so terrible, Kennedy asked one last time, why are people committing $250 million frauds to steal from us? And why are you proud of helping them do it? Senator Kennedy didn't wait for an answer. He knew there wasn't one. He began to gather the files scattered across the dais. He moved with a methodical, almost ritualistic precision. He picked up the red file, marriage fraud. He picked up the blue file, tax fraud. He picked up the green file, campaign finance theft. He picked up the black file, 9/11 minimization. He picked up the yellow file, anti-Semitism. He picked up the heavy white file, welfare fraud. He stacked them into a tower in the center of the desk. It stood nearly a foot high, a physical monument to corruption. The cameras zoomed in on the stack, the paper edges jagged and uneven, representing years of lies and deceit. Kennedy adjusted his tie. He looked at Ilhan Omar one last time. She wasn't smiling anymore. The confident, defiant congresswoman who had walked in expecting to lecture the Senate on intolerance was gone. In her place sat a woman who had been hollowed out by the truth. Her lawyer had stopped whispering. He was just staring at the wall, knowing there was no spin that could fix this. Congresswoman, Kennedy said, his voice soft but filling the room. We have covered a lot of ground today. We have established that you likely married your brother to game the immigration system. We have established that you committed tax fraud to cover it up. We have established that you funneled nearly $3 million of donor money to your lover. He tapped the stack. We have established that you have a decade-long pattern of anti-Semitism. We have established that you minimized the murder of 3,000 Americans on 9/11. And we have established that you enabled the theft of $250 million from hungry children." Kennedy leaned back, his eyes sad. "You came here with nothing," he said. "America gave you everything. We gave you safety. We gave you education. We gave you a voice in the halls of power. We trusted you. And you repaid that trust with contempt. You repaid it with theft. You repaid it with hate." "You ask why people criticize you," Kennedy said. "You say it is because of your faith. You say it is because of your hijab. You say it is because you are a refugee." He shook his head slowly. "It isn't your identity, Congresswoman. It is your actions. It is your character." "You are not a victim," Kennedy declared. "You are a predator. You prey on the goodwill of the American people. You prey on the donors who trust you. You prey on the children who need food. In Louisiana, we have a saying for people like you," Kennedy drawled. "We say you can't hide the smell of a skunk by covering it in roses. You wrap yourself in the language of social justice. You wrap yourself in the flag of victimhood. But underneath," he pointed to the stack of files, "underneath, it is just fraud. It is just hate. It is just greed." Kennedy stood up. The sound of his chair scraping against the floor was the only noise in the room. "I have no further questions," Kennedy said. "The evidence speaks for itself. But I will say this. If you have any shame left, if there is any part of that refugee child still inside you who remembers what it means to be grateful, you will resign. Because you don't deserve to represent this country. You don't even deserve to live in it." Kennedy turned and walked out of the hearing room. He didn't look back. The room remained frozen for a long moment. Then, chaos erupted. The aftermath. The hearing didn't just end. It exploded into the national consciousness. The video of Kennedy's interrogation hit the internet like a meteor strike. Within 3 hours, it had 50 million views. By the next morning, it was over 200 million. The hashtag #ToKennedyReceipts trended globally for 3 days. The image of the stack of files became an instant meme, a symbol of undeniable proof. Ilhan Omar tried to fight back. She issued a statement calling the hearing a racist show trial. She went on MSNBC to claim she was the victim of a right-wing conspiracy. But it didn't work. Not this time. The weight of the evidence was too heavy. The tax documents were real. The marriage license was real. The welfare fraud indictments were real. The Department of Homeland Security announced the following week that they were elevating their investigation into her immigration status. The IRS announced a formal audit of her 2014-2015 tax returns. The House Ethics Committee, bowing to immense public pressure, reopened the investigation into the $2.8 million campaign payments. Her polling numbers collapsed. In her own district, support evaporated. The Somali community, furious about the welfare fraud scandal that Kennedy had highlighted, turned their backs on her. 6 months later, facing a primary challenger who hammered her on the fraud and the neglect of her district, Ilhan Omar announced she would not seek re-election. She cited health reasons and a desire to spend more time with family. But everyone knew the truth. She had been Kennedy'd. On her last day in office, as she walked down the steps of the Capitol, a reporter shouted a question. "Congresswoman, do you have any regrets?" She didn't answer. She just got into her car and drove away. But back in Louisiana, Senator John Kennedy sat on his porch, sipping iced tea. He watched the news report of her resignation. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just adjusted his glasses and took a sip. "Truth has a funny way of coming out," he muttered to the empty air. Even if you gotta drag it out one file at a time. The era of the squad was cracking. The era of receipts had begun. And America was finally watching.